There is a question that has never left the human race. Not a question that appeared in one culture and spread to others. Not a question that one philosopher invented and passed down through his students. A question that arose independently in every civilization that ever existed, in every language that was ever spoken, in every corner of the world where human beings looked up at the sky and then turned their attention inward. The question is this: what am I? Not who am I? Not the name, the history, the collection of memories and roles and relationships that make up the story of a life. But what? What is this thing that is aware? What is this presence that looks out through these eyes, that feels, that wonders, that knows that it is here? What is the soul? And here is what is extraordinary. When you trace the answers that the ancient civilizations gave to this question, the Egyptians, the Vedic seers of India, the Tibetan masters, the Sufi mystics, the Platonic philosophers of Greece, the Taoist sages of China, the Hermetic lineage of the ancient Mediterranean, you find something that should not be possible. They agreed, not on every detail, not on every layer of the map, but on the essential structure, on the core of what the soul actually is, what it is made of, where it comes from, and what happens to it. They agreed with a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence or cultural borrowing. These traditions did not communicate with each other. They did not share texts or teachers. They arose in different climates, different languages, different historical circumstances, with radically different outer forms. And yet the map they drew of the soul is, at its deepest level, the same map. Tonight we are going to read that map, not as a religious exercise, not as an invitation to believe something you have not verified, as an investigation. Because the map these traditions drew is not merely historically interesting. It is a map of you, right now, as you actually are. And when you understand what it shows, when you see what every ancient civilization agreed that you actually are, something shifts. Something that has been slightly out of focus for your entire life suddenly clarifies. And you cannot go back to seeing yourself the way you did before. Let us begin with the oldest civilization whose records have survived in sufficient detail to examine: ancient Egypt. The Egyptian understanding of the human being was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated and elaborately developed in the ancient world. It was not a single simple teaching, but a complex, multi-layered system that took trained initiates years to fully understand, and that modern scholars are still working to interpret with complete accuracy. At its core, the Egyptian understanding of the soul was this: you are not one thing, you are many things. A human being is a nested system of distinct but interpenetrating aspects, each one real, each one essential, each one operating at a different level of the total reality of what you are. The Egyptians identified at least 8 distinct components of the human being. Tonight we are going to focus on the 3 that appear most consistently across all the other traditions as well. The 3 points of agreement that form the heart of what every ancient civilization knew about the soul. The first is what the Egyptians called the kat, the physical body, the material form, the temporary vehicle through which the deeper aspects of the self operate in the physical world. And here is the first point of agreement across all traditions. The physical body is not who you are. This is not a rejection of the body. It is not a claim that the body is bad or illusory or unimportant. the Egyptians took enormous care of the physical body. Their entire tradition of mummification was based on the understanding that the body had a sacred role in the larger story of the soul, but it is not the self, it is the vehicle of the self. The second component the Egyptians identified is what they called the ka, often translated as the vital force, the life energy, the animating principle that gives the physical body its capacity for experience and action. The ka is what distinguishes a living person from a corpse. Both have the same physical matter, but one has the ka and one does not. This maps directly onto what the Vedic tradition called prana, the vital life force that animates the body, and that in the Vedic understanding can be cultivated, refined, and directed through specific practices. It maps onto what the Chinese tradition called qi, the fundamental life energy that flows through the meridians of the body and whose proper circulation is the basis of health and vitality. And it maps onto what the Hermetic tradition called the vital spirit, the animating intelligence that organizes living matter into the complex self-sustaining systems we call organisms. The ka, prana, qi, vital spirit. Different words for the same recognized reality. The life force that animates the body but is distinct from it. And then there is the third component, the one that is most important for our purposes tonight. The Egyptians called it the ba. The ba is usually depicted in Egyptian art as a bird with a human head, the mobile, individual, conscious aspect of the soul that can leave the body during sleep and after death, that carries the essential character and personality of the person, and that is capable of moving freely between the world of the living and the deeper dimensions of reality. But the ba is not the deepest level of the soul. Above the ba, the Egyptians identified something they called the ak, the immortal, luminous, transfigured spirit, the aspect of the human being that is not individual in the way the ba is individual, but that participates directly in the divine intelligence that underlies all of existence. The ak is what a human being becomes, what they reveal themselves to have always been, when the process of inner transformation is complete. And the ak is where the agreement across traditions becomes most extraordinary. The Vedic tradition of ancient India is the oldest continuously living philosophical and spiritual tradition on earth. Its core texts, the Upanishads, are among the most concentrated expressions of philosophical insight in the history of human thought. Dense, precise, demanding. Written not for casual reading, but for people who were prepared to investigate their own nature with the same rigor that a scientist investigates the physical world. And at the center of the Upanishadic teaching is a distinction that maps directly onto what the Egyptians called the difference between the ba and the ak. The distinction between the jiva and the Atman. The jiva is the individual soul, the personal, bounded, story-based self that moves through a lifetime gathering experiences, forming attachments, building the narrative structure of a particular human life. The jiva corresponds closely to what the Egyptians called the ba, the mobile, individual, personality-carrying aspect of the soul. The Atman is something different. The Atman is the deepest self, the witness, the pure, undivided awareness that underlies and pervades all the contents of experience, all the thoughts, all the perceptions, all the feelings, all the memories, without being modified or diminished by any of them. The Atman is what you are when everything that is not essentially you has been set aside. And here is the most radical claim of the Upanishadic tradition. The claim that generations of students have found the most difficult to fully receive. The Atman is not separate from Brahman. Brahman, the infinite self-aware ground of all existence. And Atman, the deepest self of the individual human being, are not two different things. They are one. The individual soul, at its deepest level, is identical with the universal consciousness that underlies all of reality. Tattvamasi, that art thou, you, the awareness that is reading these words right now, are, at your most fundamental level, the same awareness that the universe is made of, not as a metaphor, not as a poetic way of expressing something that cannot quite be said directly, as the most precise statement that can be made about the actual nature of what you are. And this is where the convergence across traditions becomes impossible to dismiss. Because the Egyptian Ark, the immortal, luminous, transfigured spirit that the initiate reveals themselves to have always been, is described in the Egyptian texts in terms that are strikingly parallel to the Vedic description of the Atman, recognized as Brahman. Both traditions are pointing toward the same recognition, that beneath the personal, story-based self, beneath the individual soul with its particular history and character and memories, there is something that is not personal, not individual, not bounded by the limits of a single lifetime or a single body, something that is luminous, unchanged by experience, undamaged by loss, unlimited by the boundaries that the ordinary sense of self takes to be the definition of what it is. The Egyptians spent a civilization building temples to approach it. The Vedic seers spent millennia developing technologies for recognizing it. And they are not the only ones. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which developed in one of the most geographically isolated regions on Earth, with minimal contact with the Egyptian or Vedic traditions, arrived at a description of the soul that is so parallel to what we have already described that it demands explanation. At the center of Tibetan Buddhist teaching on the nature of mind is a concept called Rigpa. Rigpa is usually translated as awareness, but this translation, while not wrong, is insufficient. Rigpa is not awareness in the ordinary sense of being conscious of something. It is not the awareness that arises when you notice a sound or feel a sensation. Rigpa is the awareness that is aware of awareness. The naked, unadorned, self-luminous recognition that is the basis of all experience, prior to thought, prior to perception, prior to the movement of attention toward any object. The Tibetan masters describe Rigpa as having three essential qualities: empty, not in the nihilistic sense of absence, but in the sense of being free from any fixed, limited, definable nature. It cannot be grasped, measured, or contained. It is not a thing among other things. Luminous, self-aware, self-knowing, requiring no external light source to be aware of itself. It is awareness knowing itself directly, without the mediation of any object. Unobstructed, its natural expression is compassion, clarity, and spontaneous responsiveness to whatever arises without resistance or grasping. These three qualities, emptiness, luminosity, and unobstructed compassion, are what the Tibetan tradition says you actually are at the deepest level, not what you will become if you practice enough. Not a distant ideal to be approached gradually over lifetimes of effort. What you already are right now, as you sit here. The practice, in the Tibetan understanding, is not the acquisition of something new. It is the recognition of what has always already been present, obscured not by distance or difficulty, but by the habitual tendency of attention to move toward objects rather than resting in its own nature. Now compare this with what the Sufi tradition of Islam described as the deepest nature of the soul. The Sufi mystics, particularly the great 13th century mystic Ibn Arabi, whose work represents perhaps the most systematically developed description of the soul in the entire Islamic tradition, described the innermost reality of the human being as the secret, al-sirr, a luminous divine spark that is not merely given to the human being by God, but is in its deepest nature identical with the divine reality itself. Ibn Arabi's description of this innermost reality uses language that is remarkably similar to the Tibetan description of Rigpa and to the Vedic description of Atman as Brahman. Empty of any fixed nature, self-luminous, the point at which the individual and the universal are not two different things. 4 traditions, 4 different centuries and civilizations and languages and outer forms. 1 description. Let us now address the question that arises naturally at this point. If all these traditions agreed on the essential nature of the soul, if the Egyptians, the Vedic seers, the Tibetan masters, and the Sufi mystics were all pointing toward the same recognition, then why is this not the most widely known and most widely taught understanding in human civilization? Why is it that most people alive today have never encountered this teaching in a form they could fully receive? The answer has several layers. The first layer is institutional. Every one of the traditions we have described existed for most of its history within a social and political context. And in every case, the deepest teachings, the teachings about the nature of the soul at its most fundamental level, were not part of the public or exoteric tradition. They were reserved for initiates, for those who had been prepared through years of practice and the guidance of experienced teachers to receive them without distorting them. The Egyptian mystery schools were precisely that, schools of mystery. The deepest knowledge was not written on the walls of temples available to every visitor. It was transmitted orally, in carefully controlled circumstances, to those who had earned the right to receive it. The Upanishads themselves, the texts that contain the most explicit statements of the Atman Brahman identity, were traditionally taught only in the context of a direct relationship between teacher and student. The word Upanishad itself means roughly sitting near, the transmission that happens in the intimate proximity of a genuine teacher. The Tibetan tradition is perhaps the most explicit about this. The teaching of Rigpa, the recognition of the naked awareness that is the deepest nature of mind, is understood in the Tibetan tradition to require direct transmission, not just the reading of words, but the presence of a teacher who has fully stabilized this recognition and can point toward it in a way that allows the student to recognize it directly. The second layer is historical. Every one of these traditions has, at various points in history, been suppressed. The Egyptian mystery schools did not survive the conquest of Egypt by successive empires that had no interest in preserving them. The Vedic tradition was subjected to centuries of colonial disruption. The Tibetan tradition was physically attacked in the 20th century in ways that came close to destroying it entirely. The Sufi lineages have faced recurring persecution throughout Islamic history. What survived did so in fragments, in texts that were partially lost or partially misunderstood, in lineages that went underground, became secretive, transmitted their most essential knowledge only to those they could trust. The third layer is perhaps the most relevant for you personally. The knowledge of what the soul actually is requires, to be fully received, a certain preparation of the receiver. Not moral preparation in the conventional sense, not the accumulation of virtue or the performance of religious duties, but a genuine willingness to look, to turn attention toward the question of what you actually are with the same seriousness and sustained interest that you would bring to any genuine investigation. And this willingness is, in the modern world, harder to come by than it might seem. Not because people are uninterested in the question, but because the conditions that allow the question to be held with sufficient depth and stillness, the quiet, the spaciousness, the freedom from constant distraction, are increasingly rare. The ancient traditions understood this. They built their mystery schools in remote locations precisely because they knew that the recognition of the deepest nature of the soul requires a quality of inner stillness that is almost impossible to sustain in the middle of ordinary social life. Now let us turn to the question of what this actually means for you. Because everything we have described so far has been pointing toward something practical, something that is not merely interesting to know about, but that changes in a direct and immediate way the quality of your actual experience. The ancient traditions were not describing the soul as a theological concept to be believed in or disputed. They were describing the soul as something you can directly verify. The Egyptian initiation process, whatever its precise form, which we do not fully know, was designed to produce a direct experience of what the actually is, not a belief about it, not a doctrine concerning it, a direct, immediate, undeniable encounter with the luminous, immortal aspect of what you are. The Vedic tradition is perhaps the most explicit about this. The entire apparatus of Vedic philosophy, the elaborate conceptual structures of Samkhya and Vedanta, the practices of yoga in all its forms, the investigation of the nature of awareness described in the Upanishads, has a single purpose: not to produce correct beliefs about the soul, to produce the direct recognition of what the soul actually is. The Sanskrit term for this recognition is Atma Jnana, self-knowledge. Not knowledge about the self in the way you might have knowledge about history or science, but the direct knowing of what the self is, the self knowing itself, in the way that a light reveals itself in the very act of illuminating. And the Tibetan tradition is equally unambiguous. Rigpa, the naked awareness that is your deepest nature, is not something that has to be created, cultivated, or achieved. It is here now. It has always been here. The only reason it is not recognized is that attention is habitually directed outward, toward thoughts, toward objects, toward the endless stream of experience, rather than resting in what the Tibetan masters call its natural state. The practice of pointing out, the most essential transmission in the Tibetan tradition, is not a technique for creating something new. It is the teacher pointing toward what is already present in such a way that the student suddenly notices it directly. And when that noticing happens, when awareness recognizes itself, what is noticed is not strange or foreign or distant. It is the most familiar thing in existence, more familiar than any thought or perception or sensation, more present than anything the ordinary self has ever encountered. Because it is what has been present through every moment of your experience, not as one of the contents of experience, but as the space in which all experience arises. The ancient traditions are unanimous on what this recognition produces. Not detachment from life, not withdrawal from the world, not the end of feeling or caring or engaging. The opposite, a freedom from the contraction of the isolated, frightened self, and therefore a capacity for genuine engagement with life that was not possible before. A love that is not dependent on circumstances remaining comfortable. A stability that is not disturbed by the inevitable changes and losses of a human life. A clarity that sees what is actually happening in yourself and in the world, without the distorting lens of fear and the desperate need for things to be different from what they are. This is what the ancient traditions called liberation. Not freedom from the world. Freedom to be fully present in it. If you have followed this conversation all the way to this point, through the Egyptian layers of the soul, through the Vedic teaching of Atman and Brahman, through the Tibetan recognition of Rigpa, through the Sufi description of the innermost divine spark, then something has happened that goes beyond the accumulation of interesting information. Something has been pointed at, and something in you, something very quiet, very close, more immediate than any thought or feeling, may have recognized what was being pointed at. Not fully, not with the completeness that comes from years of practice and the guidance of a realized teacher, but enough to know that the direction is real, enough to know that the ancient traditions were not describing something mythological or metaphorical or reserved for a special category of human beings. They were describing you, the awareness that has been present through every moment of your experience, the knowing that has never been absent, the simple, clear, unadorned fact of being aware prior to every thought, underlying every perception, undisturbed by every change in the content of experience. That is what the Egyptians called the Akh. That is what the Vedic tradition called Atman. That is what the Tibetan masters called Rigpa. That is what the Sufi mystics called the secret, al-sirr. The innermost divine reality that every human being is, whether they know it or not. And here is what I want to say to you directly before we close tonight, that the recognition of what you actually are is not the end of the story of your life. It is the beginning of a different relationship with that story. The struggles do not disappear. The losses do not stop happening. The ordinary difficulties of a human life, the relationships, the work, the body, the grief, continue, but they are met from a different ground. But from the ground of knowing that what you most fundamentally are has never been damaged by any of it, has never been diminished by failure, has never been reduced by loss, has never been absent from even the darkest moments of your experience. The ancient traditions spent thousands of years and immeasurable human effort developing the maps and the methods and the transmission lineages to make this recognition available. They did not do this because it was interesting. They did it because they understood, with the clarity of people who had verified it directly, that this recognition is the most important thing a human being can do, more important than any external achievement, more fundamental than any question of success or failure in the world. Because everything else, every relationship, every creation, every act of service, every moment of beauty or love, is met either from the contracted stance of the frightened, isolated self, or from the open, stable, luminous ground of what you actually are. And the difference between those two ways of meeting life is the difference between a life of chronic, low-level suffering and a life of genuine freedom. At Sacred Flame, this is the territory we exist to explore, not from a distance, not as observers of interesting traditions, as people who believe with increasing certainty that this recognition is available now to human beings alive in the world today, in the middle of ordinary lives with ordinary difficulties, in a world that has never been more in need of what the ancient traditions discovered. Subscribe if this work matters to you. Share this with someone who is ready for it. And keep watching, because what is coming goes deeper, becomes more specific, and moves closer to the practical reality of how this recognition actually arrives in a human life. We began tonight with a question, not a new question. The oldest question, what am I? And we followed that question through 4 of the most sophisticated systems of knowledge ever developed by human beings, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, and found that they all gave the same answer. You are not the body. The body is the vehicle, essential, sacred, worthy of care, but not the self. You are not the personal soul, the individual, story-based, bounded self that moves through a lifetime gathering experience. That is real at its own level, but it's not the deepest level. At the deepest level, beneath the physical body, beneath the vital force, beneath the personal soul with its particular history and character, there is something that every tradition we have examined tonight pointed toward with the full weight of its collective wisdom. Something that is not personal, not individual, not bounded by birth or death or the particular circumstances of a single human life. Something luminous, empty of fixed nature, self-aware, undamaged by experience, already whole. The Egyptians called it the Ak, the immortal, transfigured spirit that the initiate reveals themselves to have always been. The Vedic tradition called it Atman, the deepest self, identical at its root, with Brahman, the infinite ground of all existence. The Tibetan masters called it Rigpa, the naked, luminous awareness that is the basis of all experience and the deepest nature of mind. The Sufi mystics called it al-sirr, the secret, the innermost divine spark that is not merely given to the human being, but is, at its most fundamental level, what the human being actually is. Different words, different outer forms, different centuries and civilizations and languages. One recognition. And here is what that recognition means. Not philosophically, not theologically, but in the actual texture of your actual life. The longing you carry, the sense that something is missing, that something more real than the life you're living is somehow available, that the version of yourself you inhabit is not the whole of what you are, that longing is not a mistake. It is not a symptom of dysfunction. It is not something to be managed or suppressed or explained away. It is the Ak calling the Ba home. It is Atman recognizing that Brahman is not elsewhere. It is Rigpa noticing its own presence through the gap between thoughts. It is al-sirr, the innermost secret, pressing toward the surface of your life, insisting on being recognized. Every ancient civilization that ever seriously investigated the nature of the human soul arrived at this, not as a hope, not as a belief, as a finding, verifiable, reproducible, available to any human being willing to look with sufficient honesty and sufficient stillness. The map exists, the territory is real, and you, the awareness reading these words right now, are already standing in it. You have always been standing in it. Until next time, stay awake,